So good afternoon, everyone. I think we're going to start since we are 6 minutes past our start time. My name is Alina Polyakova. I'm director of the project on global democracy and emerging technologies and fellow at the Brookings Institution, which is based in Washington. And it's really my pleasure to moderate and have a more engaged discussion with all of you. It's a smaller group format. So we're going to break up the traditional panel discussion, and just feel free to ask questions as we're talking. Just catch my eye. Don't yell questions out randomly, and we can have more of a conversation versus a panel discussion. This is the breakout session on the Dusk of Liberal Democracies era, which I feel like we've had sessions on this topic for a very long time. I've been working on the rise of right-wing populism for the majority of my professional academic career. And I think we've been having discussions whether we've hit peak populism ever since I can remember. And that debate is back in vogue today. But I think, I hope we'll talk about in a bit more nuanced detail in this conversation is not just about the political implications of the rise of extremes on both sides, the left and the right, in Europe, also in the United States, and elsewhere in the liberal democratic West, but also about the global trends that we're seeing today in the pushback against democracy, but also how democratic actors themselves are pushing back against illiberalism and authoritarianism in their own countries. So I will not do long introductions, but just very quickly, immediately to my right is Mosharraf Zaidi, who is currently the Chief Executive Officer of Tabadlab in Pakistan. Did I pronounce that correctly? Thank you. To Mosharraf's immediate right is Laurent Pech, who's the professor and head of the Law and Politics Department at Middlesex University in London, so welcome. And last but certainly not least is David Kramer, who's a senior fellow at the Havel Program on Human Rights and director of European and Eurasian Studies of Florida International University. Welcome, David. Always a pleasure to see you as well. So I'm going to skip around the panel a little bit, but I wanted to start with you, Mosharraf. I mentioned this, the global trends that we're experiencing today, and I think certainly we can all point to specific cases or instances, not least of which potentially being Hungary and Poland, where we're seeing a lot of rollbacks in democratic institutions. But kind of panning out from specific case examples, what is the bigger global picture and so the trends toward or against democracy, and what's your assessment where this is all heading?
Thanks, Alina. I mean, first of all, Europe, of course, is in many ways the birthplace of a lot of these ideals and ideas, and in my view, we tend to think of populism only in one direction, which is right wing. But this populist wave that we're seeing, many people might say that it began in Greece with actually a left wing government. So populism doesn't just work in one direction; it works in both. And going to the title of this panel, Vox Populi Vox Dei, the voice of the people is the voice of God. Now, hopefully this isn't being recorded, because in some countries it's challenging to speak like this when referring to God. But actually, I'm not referring to God. But the idea that it's the voice of the people is the voice of God, I think, belongs in an era when not every person had a voice. If every idiot has a voice, then surely that can't be the voice of God. And I think that at the heart of what's happening now is a shift in technology. The foundations of how knowledge, information, and opinion is manufactured, collated, mobilized, and presented, that technology is fundamentally changed. And I was speaking to you earlier about the algorithm. Essentially, the fact that every person on the planet virtually now has the ability to write a 140-character op-ed. And essentially
280 characters.
There you go. Sorry, I'm old-fashioned. If even I'm old-fashioned, you can see where things are headed. If you have a bunch of PhDs like we do on this, I think 3/4 of the panel here is made up of PhDs. In the old world, in the world that most of us are used to and comfortable in, and I think many of us yearn for a return to, the factualness and the factiveness of what people like David and Laurent, what they say, it had great weight, and it was determined that there was something to it. If somebody spent 20 years studying a topic, they must know what they're talking about, and we lend authority to that scholarship and to that experience and to that wisdom. That is not how the world of information works anymore. And so, to me, what we're seeing is not, and I'll keep the answer short. I mean, basically, to me, what we're seeing is not a short-term blip, and it's not necessarily right-wing or left-wing, although in most cases it's manifesting itself in a certain direction. What we're seeing is a shift in technology that has altered the requirements of human societies and of democracies in terms of the institutional responses to this change in technology. So as long as the institutions that were built for the 19th and 20th century continue to operate in a 21st century mode of production as far as opinion, knowledge, and information are concerned, we'll continue to feel this sense of, in some cases, melancholy, and in other cases, desperate urgency and a sense of emergency that something is badly wrong. It isn't necessarily that something fundamental about people or democracy has changed. It's just that the expression and the mechanism and institutions within that have changed and demand a response. And we're not able to act as fast as Facebook and Twitter have.
So just a quick follow-up question. I think it's interesting that not that long ago we were talking about the liberating forces of the digital revolution, that access to communication was going to empower people's movements, right? It was going to lead to kind of a fourth wave of democratization across the world. And some of that seemed to be coming true, right? The Twitter revolutions, the Arab Spring in Ukraine as well, right? And now how quickly have we shifted to not talking about the externalities, negative externalities, and how these technologies are being actively subverted by authoritarian regimes to monitor, surveil their own population, and also to export these kind of surveillance technologies abroad. And what I think you're pointing out, this is where I want to dig into a little bit. You use this term like the algorithm, right, is reshaping our societies. What are you really talking about? I think when we're talking about technological change, it's important to be really specific in what we mean. You seem to be describing the social media companies and how people are using those, and also how they're also being subverted from the other side. So can you talk a little bit more what you mean about what you mean when you say the algorithm is transforming societies?
So I think in its simplest form, what I mean, and it is a simplification, maybe a gross oversimplification, at least for friends who work in the technology and in the social media space. But what I mean by the algorithm is essentially a mechanism through which the most extreme and the most shocking expressions are the ones that will be most visible. And partly this algorithm is just human nature. We always slow down our car and rubberneck when we see a car crash. If traffic is proceeding as normal, 60 miles an hour, 100 kilometers an hour, there's no reason for us to slow down and look at the traffic. I mean, you have to be really spiritual to kind of slow life down and really, say, I want to observe the normalcy of life. But in most cases, what we want to observe, what we want to take time out to look at, is a car crash, is a car wreck, something extraordinary. And so the algorithm has pronounced that in a profound sort of way, where it's actually begun to dig into the recesses of the human mind and basically extract the most brutal, the most shocking, the thing that will be seen the most. And what that does in terms of how it incentivizes human communication, both at the micro individual to individual level and at the macro level, and especially at the macro level, is that it incentivizes our seeking the shocking as the thing that we put out there to draw traffic, whether it's likes or RTs or hearts or whatever technology you're using, but those clicks or those taps. And if you think about how technology companies have internalized this mechanism, you think of the hepatic movements. If most of you have used social media, you'll notice that when you press the heart in the Twitter app, there's a slight there's a slight shake of the phone. Similar things happen with likes on Facebook, and similar things happen on Snap and on Insta. And in all of these cases, what the actual algorithm, the technology is doing is it's creating a feedback loop that supposedly includes a slight release of dopamine. It'll depend from individual to individual. But the idea is very clear. The idea is that you should become Pavlovized into clicking on and being drawn into the thing that draws you in, and that is shock and awe.
Yeah, just a quick comment, and then I want to take it over to David. I think what you point to is the fact that we sort of assumed at the onset of the social media revolution that these technologies were empowering human agency. But in fact, they have proven to be, because of the kind of economic incentive structure that is driving these companies' business models, they're actually disempowering individual agency. And I think one prominent example of this that I've come across is, for example, the YouTube algorithm, in the sense that most of the billions of hours that are watched on YouTube on a daily basis are not actively chosen by users. They're not resulting from people searching for a specific video. It's content that's being delivered to you by the algorithm. And when we think about the implications of that for things like conspiracy theories, all these sensationalist content, the power that these platforms have is immense, and it's almost unimaginable. And I think we don't think about it as day-to-day users. So I think how we've switched from empower to disempowerment of individuals because of this, the incentive structure set up by social media companies, I think is fascinating and does have profound implications for the future of democracy. But I want to go over to David. So I think Mosharraf painted a pretty bleak picture, right? That this digital revolution is outpacing our ability as democracies to respond, and it's leading to some, I think, profoundly counter-democratic outcomes. Is there, though, maybe a bright light here, David? I look to you to give us maybe a little bit more context to how are people in these countries, or in any countries that you can think of, responding and fighting back?
Alina, thanks, and thank you for not asking me about algorithms. Since I don't tweet, do Facebook, Instagram, I don't do any of that. I don't disagree with anything Mosharraf said, and I think there are many reasons to be concerned and worried about what is happening in the world today, not least with efforts by the Russian government, the Chinese government, with what's happening with the populist movements, with the sliding back of democracies on this continent and elsewhere, and of course, not least, what's happening in our country, in the United States, which is deeply disturbing. That said, as someone who has been in and out of government and in and out of the activist NGO world when I was at Freedom House, despair is not an option. And so I think it is important to latch on to what I find very encouraging signs around the world. If you look at what's been happening in Hong Kong with the demonstrations that have been occurring there, now increasingly with people turning out at great risk to their safety and their welfare. If you look at what has been happening in places like Algeria or Sudan, if you look at what's happened in Tunisia, where the country is in the process of holding a presidential election. If you look at protesters in Moscow and elsewhere in Russia, if you look at the election in Ukraine that produced an enormous mandate for a president who has come in saying ending the problem of corruption is going to be his top priority, and trying to resolve the war with Russia is also on his list. I do think that as we look at this, there are reasons for inspiration and hope that the cause of freedom is still alive and well. What pains me in looking at these positive, optimistic signs is the lack of support and engagement from the established democracies, where I would argue, having worked in the Bush administration in the previous decade, the war in Iraq, the invasion of Iraq, did some real damage to the cause of democracy promotion. There's no question about it. Even though George Bush himself was passionate and genuine in his support for the freedom agenda. President Obama, unfortunately, I would argue, did not live up to expectations when it came to standing for human rights and democracy. You could cite Iran, Syria, and elsewhere. And then the current administration in the US shows, I wish it would show lack of interest. Instead, it seems to show utter disdain for these causes. And I struggle to think, what would the world look like if actually there was US leadership on these issues? How much better off would these forces be? Maybe one could even make a counterintuitive argument, maybe they're better off without the heavy hand of the United States. I tend to think that there is a middle ground there, that we could be doing much more to lend support. But there is and I'll end with this, there is a larger crisis of confidence among the established democracies here in this continent and in the United States, where you have support for withdrawing from institutions that have been critical to preserving the peace and maintaining security and stability on this continent, where you have people espousing sovereignty at the expense of working together in alliances. And this, I fear, can be a demoralizing and dispiriting effect on those who, on a daily basis, go out and risk their lives in the cause of freedom, demanding an end to corruption, and for a better future for their countries.
Thanks, David. I'm not sure that was an optimistic take or not, to be honest with you, but let's just go with it as a point of optimism. I mean, I will say that we just had our Russia panel this morning, and there are a few people from the Russian Federation here today who are fighting that fight in the most repressive of contexts. And I think you're right to point to those individuals as sort of beacons of hope in their own countries, and ones that established democracies, if that's the term we want to use, should continue to support. But you mentioned this idea of there being kind of a crisis of confidence in established democracies, and it does very much feel like democracy as a concept is sort of on the back foot, right? That authoritarians are on the rise, obviously being led by Putin in Moscow and Xi in Beijing, and they appear to be an increasingly more appealing model of governance. Even in established democracies, there have been many troubling surveys now showing that young people don't see the value of democracies as much as their parents did, that they're more comfortable or willing to accept military rule because they probably have no experience in military rule. But I also wonder, if we look at the bigger picture, some people say, well, okay, a larger portion of the global population lives in a democracy than was the case, not that long ago, 20 years ago. Actually, the world is getting richer. More people are coming out of poverty if we look at the big picture. So are we just drowning in cynicism and pessimism? And so are we letting the authoritarian narrative win? Because we're not actually on the back foot, but we're acting like it, right? So to what extent do you think that this narrative that democracies are kind of falling apart, that we're on decline, that we're on the back foot, is representative of reality, or is that just an internal anxiety that we're feeling right now?
It depends on how you measure it. If you look at Freedom House surveys for the past 13 years, there's been a decline in political rights and civil liberties around the world, but it is not a precipitous drop. If you look at when the Freedom House surveys first started in the 1970s, there has been a vast increase in countries that are labeled free, according to Freedom House's categories: free, partly free, and not free. There has been a vast expansion of free countries around the world. There's also been an increase in the number of countries around the world. And so I think there is reason to be optimistic. That said, there is no linear path toward democratic development. There is no guarantee of freedom down the road, as we're discovering in the United States these days, where there are questions being raised. And so maintaining democracy or fighting for democracy and sustaining it is something that requires effort every single day. It also requires being a little more confident, but, and the last thing is, it requires democracies to deliver. If people don't see democracies delivering, then they might become disillusioned. And that's what leads to populism and the appeal of populism. So democracies have a constant challenge, not just to guarantee people's rights, but to make sure that people are optimistic about their futures. And I think there has been a disconnect in that area for, say, the past decade or so.
Right, I think we have a whole separate conversation about the fractionalization of politics that we're seeing in Europe that is leading to a certain stagnation of decision-making that is preventing, I think, democratic governments from delivering, right? And we're seeing this in, I think, country after country with these, very weak coalition governments being formed. We see this at the EU level, the last parliamentary elections. And so I do wonder if we're entering kind of an era of democratic paralysis or stagnation that will empower, some of these more strongman style governance structures or leaders, right? I'll just leave that out there just as a reminder before I take it to Laurent. If you have a question, just catch my eye. Happy to take it any time during our discussion. And if you have a specific follow-up, we'll use the DC rule, which is the two-finger rule. So if you have something directly to say to what one of the panelists said or what one of the audience members said, just give me two fingers and try to see you above these bright lights. But Laurent, I want to take it down to, we were talking about really kind of abstract global trends. You work on very concrete issues that are of key relevance to where we are today, which is Poland, but in Europe more broadly, issues of rule of law and judicial independence in Europe. And I think one of the most troubling things that I've been observing over the years is what David refers to as a nonlinear pattern, right? So we're seeing that there's actually backsliding happening in what we thought were countries of the former East that were well on the way to becoming flourishing democracies with active civil societies. And it seems like now that path is going the other direction. There was a letter sent to the new head of the European Commission a few weeks ago for some of the key heads of judicial institutions of the EU that expressed their concern about the kinds of trends, and they didn't name countries by name, I don't believe, but the kinds of trends they're seeing in some EU member states on judicial independence, the rollbacks in specific rule of law legislations that some governments are pushing through today. What are your thoughts on where that's heading in Europe specifically?
Thank you very much. The first time, actually, the EU as an institution started worrying about what is called nowadays democratic and rule of law backsliding is actually, it took place in, it was through a speech from the then President of the Commission in 2013. He spoke then, President Barroso was his name, spoke of a new type of threats to the democratic fabric of European societies. Then we didn't yet talk about rule of law, democratic backsliding. And in those days, 3 countries were actually in the news, France, Romania, Hungary. Hungary, actually, just to refer back to the Freedom House ranking, has become the first EU member state to ever been downgraded from free to partly free last year. So that's a concrete example of according to the Freedom House ranking, of a backsliding EU member state, which was something which was not supposed to happen, because before you join the EU, you're supposed to go through a very careful technical monitoring process, bringing you up to speed when it comes to democratic and rule of law standards. But where are we now since the diagnosis made by President Barroso in 2014? Where we have at least 2 countries which are being seen as problematical from a democratic and rule of law point of view according to the EU, these 2 countries being Poland and Hungary, which are both subject to a provision, a legal provision, which was supposed never to be activated when it was first drafted by lawyers. This provision just is known by the number 7, and the nickname of the provision at the time when it was first drafted, the nickname was a nuclear option. So like nuclear weapons, this was a legal provision. You're not supposed to trigger, or when you trigger it, then it's too late, we're all going to die. Now, it was triggered twice, not once, and we're still there. But the situation doesn't seem to have been improving, according to the EU institutions. To go back to the letter you referred to, it's a very recent letter and a very striking letter. I would advise you to read it if you want to know more about the diagnosis from the top European judges about the rule of law situation in the EU or in Europe in general. according to the presidents of three European judicial networks, we are witnessing the proactive dismantlement of checks and balances in a number of countries. No countries were mentioned, but we can guess, I guess, the most problematical ones. But the wording was quite striking. It's very rare for judges to speak so openly and so dramatically. And I think, in fact, the diagnosis is entirely correct. We are seeing, what my own definition of rule of law backsliding, for what it's worth, is that this is not just a mistake or just a minor rule of law shortcoming. There's always room for perfection when it comes to compliance with the rule of law. We are talking about elected authorities deliberately, systematically planning the slow dismantlement of all checks and balances with the view of creating de facto one-party regimes. These de facto one-party regimes are still like to describe themselves as democratic regimes, but since normally at some point in this process they get rid of fair elections, then they should not be described as democracies. In fact, a recent label I saw was quite accurate in my view. A US professor spoke of pseudo-democracies because then there is no longer any free and fair election. Before you get to this point, however, you have usually several steps. I devised myself a so-called constitutional capture recipe. I've been studying essentially the undermining of the rule of law and how does it work. In fact, now there seem to be autocrats or would-be autocrats tend to follow the same recipe or the same key steps. I'm not going to go through all the steps, but what is the first? When should you start getting worried if you do believe in the liberal understanding of the rule of law? Well, you should start worrying when the will of the people argument is being used to take control of the constitutional court or the Supreme Court of the country, or both, if the country has a constitutional court and a Supreme Court. At the same time, normally, the ruling party is going to try to capture the public broadcaster. Why is it so important to do this at the same time? Because while you're violating the national constitution, then you can shape the public narrative having captured the public broadcaster, pretending that the constitution is illegitimate, so it's fine to actually violate it because that's what the people want, the will of the people. And when you start using the will of the people, then it means also you can denounce enemies of the people at the same time. So this is the rhetoric accompanying usually the dismantlement of the rule of law. He always begins with the capture of the judicial branch and the capture of the public broadcaster.
Yeah, I think what you're pointing to is the emergence of this sort of authoritarian toolkit or a liberal toolkit that has been propagated perhaps first and foremost in Russia, then in Turkey, and in a certain extent now is coming towards and is embedding itself among some political rulers here in the European Union, which I think is troubling. I do have a follow-up question for you, but I want to look at the audience to see if we have questions already. So let me take 1, 2, 3 questions. I know there's a mic, but I think we should be able to hear you. There's a mic, so there's 1, 2, 3. But the question that I think is that I was going to ask about the entire panel, you can work at it in response to some of the audience questions, and for you specifically, Laurent, is it seems like the EU specifically is very, very limited in the post-accession phase as to what it can actually do, because nobody expected, as you said, these kinds of backsliding operations, you could say, to take place. And I've been working a lot trying to figure out what can international institutions do. And I would love to hear a little bit more about some very specific things besides the Article 7 proceedings that you think could be done. And that's also a question to you, David, and to you, Mosharraf. I mean, what is to be done, right? This is the question we always come back to. And instead of having a more intellectual debate about where we are, I think we can all agree that maybe we can disagree on the degree of democratic backsliding, decline, the rise of authoritarianism, the global trends we're seeing. But I think we're all in agreement that there's something changing here, and it's being driven by a variety of factors, whether it be technological, political, the failure of multilateralism, right? So what can we do? But I'll leave you to think about that. Let me start with some questions here.
Yes, Alberto Fernandez, MBN. I hear you talk about democracy and freedom, but it seems to me that what you're talking about is liberalism. And I think there's a very dangerous conflating that you do. The language you use, the language of democratic backsliding. I mean, for an outsider, for example, one might think that the EU is a one-party regime. There's a kind of EU ideology, which is one party. So I would just kind of push back on that. I mean, it's almost as if you're saying you're all for democracy, you're all for freedom, as long as the wrong people don't win those elections.
Okay, fair enough. Next question. Bobo, is that you?
Yeah, Bobo Low. Alina, you mentioned this in the Russia discussion before, but you've reiterated it, and it's going to be something that comes up in the China liberal international order debate that we have later. It seems to me you're positing that China and Russia are, if you like, offering an alternative model of authoritarian governance, state capitalism, whatever you like to call it. And yet, is that really what they're doing, or are they merely taking advantage of the vacuum of liberal democracy's failure to deliver, as highlighted by David? So the problem is actually less with the assertiveness or aggression of Russia and China than with our own shortcomings. Then we basically have to get our game together. So I'd be interested in the panel's response to that.
Thank you, Bobo. Roland?
Thanks very much. I'm Roland Freudenstein from the Martin Center in Brussels. Here's me playing Orban's advocate to Laurent Pech. The rhetoric is to this constitutional capture, as you called it. The going rhetoric also in Warsaw is, look, both the public media as well as the Constitutional Court were captured by previous governments, and actually there are residues of communist rule in there, which we finally have the opportunity to remove. So first of all, we're doing with the public media, we're doing something every government before us has done, including liberal ones. And on the courts, court packing and all this has been the practice, and we're actually completing democracy by setting things right. And then there's a whole bunch of whataboutism arguments, even about West European countries. So how do you respond to that?
Is that two finger or single finger? Two finger. Okay, well, let's go ahead. Let's go ahead.
Thanks. Joanna Lisiecka. I am a former program manager of the election observation missions for the EU. Both stemming from my professional experience, but also I'm Polish, so I'm the child of the democratic transition. I think I would like to go back a little bit, and if you might also go back more to this cyber context in which we live, because I have a feeling that current democratic societies are about narratives, and both seeing the emerging democracies around the world and seeing the transition in my country, I have a feeling that this big freedom wave in many countries, it's about getting the freedom, but no one is telling anything about checks and balances. So even people who still live with this ideal of freedom and of Western societies are just exchanging the freedom to do something into freedom to buy something. So I don't want to sound Marxist, but we also shouldn't forget the merge of, also it's a little bit talking about liberalism, merge of the liberal democracy, but of the worldview of the West also, which is capitalism. So basically people choose the way to live in the West way, and the image is, I'm not telling about people highly educated, but I'm quite highly educated, and no one really mentioned the checks and balances during my education either. So, and just exchanging this freedom to vote, freedom of speech for the freedom to buy.
So let me stop there and let everybody respond, but if I may start, Laurent, let's start with you since didn't quite let you finish, and then we'll go around to if you want to pick up on any of that.
You asked me about whether there is a solution. I mean, if there was one, then we would have found it already. This is something the EU system was not designed to address, because we thought all the all democratic rule of law relating issues would be essentially dealt with as part of the enlargement process, as part of the pre-enlargement scrutiny. So when in 2013-14 we started discussing this problem, a lot of people were saying that essentially the EU lacked the tools to address the issue. So we've been adding to the toolbox ever since. But not so successfully. I'm just describing what has been happening. My diagnosis actually is a bit different. In fact, my diagnosis would be, yes, the system was not designed to address what I call democratic and rule of law backsliding, but we have all the tools we need. But I think the key issue has been for a long time the lack of understanding of what kind of threat we are dealing with. There was a lot of denial about the kind of a threat to the rule of law we were dealing with. Now there is no any more denial about the existence of an issue. So we actually have just been, lawyers, at least the Commission has brought a number of legal cases before the Court of Justice using very old-fashioned procedures to address piece by piece some of the issues. Now, on this, however, there is something important in the pipeline. The Commission published a so-called blueprint for action last July, and for the first time, whether it's going to be working or not, I don't know. For the first time, the EU is going to build a new so-called rule of law review cycle, which is supposed to be applicable to every single EU member state and which is supposed to be permanent in nature. So for the first time, essentially, it would seem that all the EU countries are going to be subject to some sort of a permanent monitoring mechanism, the same type of mechanism we have used previously for EU candidate countries. So whether this is the solution or not, it's too early to say. I got quite a few questions, but essentially, let me go back to the question about how do you address some of the counter-arguments. There's plenty, actually, plenty of arguments which have been used against the EU to stop the EU from acting. Constitutional identity is one of the most recent claims. So essentially, the claim is that every member state must be sovereign when it comes to essentially key democratic and rule of law choices. But my answer to this is, as an EU lawyer and working on this issue, is that I have no objection whatsoever as an EU lawyer to national governments pursuing different policies. I do have, however, an issue with national governments undermining the structural elements of their political regimes, and when the elements they are modifying no longer comply with what it means to be a member of the EU. So membership of the EU does mean complying with a number of key structural requirements. Free and fair elections is part of the package. Judicial independence is part of the package. Now, you cannot argue, for instance, that a member state has the right not to publish judgments in order to disregard them. This is rule of law 101. I don't buy the subsidiarity argument. And this is a concrete example of what I'm saying. I don't buy the argument that a member state is entitled, in the name of under the legislative majority he has gained, to amend or violate the Constitution when the rules are different for the Constitution. So essentially, my point is, this is not an issue, this is not a political disagreement about policies. Whether you are pro or anti-immigration, irrelevant to me as an EU lawyer. What matters to me is that you comply with the basic ingredients of EU membership. This is part of the package. You don't like it, you have a different understanding. You argue that, for instance, the liberal concept of democracy, you don't like it anymore. I'm sorry, but this is part of the EU membership package. And then you can always trigger another provision of the EU, and then you can solidify, consolidate so-called illiberal democracy outside of the EU.
So this goes back to one of the questions posed about, is this a crisis of democracy or a crisis of liberalism? And Mosharraf, I want to take it over to you. You don't have to answer that question, but pick up on whatever themes you'd like.
Well, I found that comment to resonate with essentially what I was going to say. I mean, you know, when Lula was president in Brazil, you know, Brazilian democracy was working. I mean, I loved it. I was a big fan of Lula, a big fan of Bolsa Familia and many of the other things he did. And then the same democratic system produces Bolsonaro, and now I don't like it as much. And of course, that's not about democracy. That's about what I like and what I don't like. And I think that a lot of the discussion, I think there's some obviously, as Laurent has mentioned, there's a number of technical aspects to this, but the filtering mechanism here, I think, and this goes back to my original point, I think we are trying to grapple with institutions that were constructed to deliver a certain. Do you want to just jump in right now? Because it's two fingers. That's fine. I'm happy for you to jump in. That's why. So I don't think that. To me, I think this is a crisis of the system, and I think maybe to be quite provocative, as I had warned you, I would be. I mean, I think we need to revisit adult franchise at some level, right? I think that if you have people like Nigel Farage, who, in my opinion, is a destroyer of systems, of democracy, of harmony, of society, who has the privilege, because of the enormous luxuries that the British democratic system affords to its citizens, to jump into the national discourse, to enjoy the freedoms that that system offers, to help reduce the freedoms and to reduce the workingness, the functionality of that society and that state, then that should come with some responsibilities. And of course, Western liberal Democrats find this abhorrent, right? The suggestion that we should qualify adult franchise, because the first thing a lot of you guys would think of is China and Russia and other, I mean, and obviously Europe's own deeply problematic history in terms of qualifying citizenship and qualifying adult franchise. But I think that there's different ways to qualify it. If you have spent 5 years at the local city council, if you spent 10 years at the Board of Education, visiting the parent-teacher meetings, if you are involved in solid waste management at the local level, if you are invested in your local church, your local synagogue, your local mosque, then you are clearly a more proactive member of society than the newspaper columnist who doesn't go to any of those social institutions because he's too busy flying off to Warsaw and other places for conferences. So if the contest for adult franchise is defined by participation, as I'm just using one example, as opposed to color of skin or sect of religion or what other kinds of qualifiers that have been suggested in history and even in the recent past, then I think an open conversation about adult franchise, I think, might be one way forward. Another way forward, and this is possibly even more controversial, is the listening democracy that China is building. And of course, that's the surveillance state where China is tracking everything that you're doing. But perhaps one of the reasons why, and of course Hong Kong, I think, is a slightly different example. But one of the reasons why post-Tiananmen Square you haven't seen the emergence of a populist, anti-state movement in China, one explanation is that it's very hardcore. And so anytime there's any dissent, they go and shut it down. But could it also be that when there is a reason for dissent, the state is able to pick that up because it's so focused on surveillance, because it's so focused on repression and on limited freedoms, that actually it figures out what's going on in the country and addresses that cause for dissent. Not in every case, but in some cases, certainly at the local municipal level, things that don't excite so many of us, but that at the functional street level, Main Street China, actually helps make China, a more functional place. I think the idea really behind what I'm thinking about is not so much to make an argument pro-China or anti-Western democracy, pro-Hungary or Bolsonaro or Orban, and anti-Macron or EU. I think the argument really is maybe it's time for us to revisit institutions that haven't seen any re-engineering or reform foundationally when society itself has undergone this transformational reform of basically every person representing a version of the Wall Street Journal or Le Monde on their smartphone. And therefore, the idea somehow that the people that write op-eds in the Wall Street Journal and Le Monde have some sort of continued privilege actually has been destroyed by, as I said earlier, the algorithm.
Bobo had a two-finger, and then I want to take it over to David.
Yes, it's interesting what you were talking about, in a way, a Chinese form of accountability or responsiveness. In the pre-Xi Jinping era, a leading China specialist, actually head of president of the BHP Bulletin in China, told me that the Chinese had a three-part approach to dealing with mass disturbances. They would arrest the ringleaders, they would punish the bureaucrats that had allowed the situation to get out of control and go all the way to the imperial capital, and then they would respond to what they saw as relatively legitimate concerns. So they would be responsive to people's grievances, but it would be this sort of three-tiered approach. And that kind of worked to a point. The big question, of course, is that maybe that's got lost since Xi Jinping's consolidated power.
David?
Just a few quick things. One, let's remember that elections have led to bad results for quite a while. Adolf Hitler came to power through elections, and that was 86 years ago, 87 years ago. And so elections do sometimes produce not very great results, and that's the consequences of how people choose to vote. I deliberately use the terms democracy and human rights and freedom, not liberalism. And what I mean by that are free and fair elections, rule of law, separation of powers, checks and balances, and respect for human rights. To me, those are the essential ingredients of democracy, with a vibrant civil society and a free press, because a vibrant civil society and a free press act as additional checks and balances on those in power. I tend not to like the terms liberal or illiberal democracy. I think they become euphemisms for not wanting to call regimes authoritarian or semi-authoritarian. And so I prefer the more standard language that Freedom House uses. On Bobo, your earlier question, I think, is a critical one. I agree that Putin is not trying to offer an alternative. He is trying to bring our systems down to his level. He is trying to keep countries along his borders from becoming successful, vibrant democracies that could offer an alternative to his model, which is a thoroughly rotten, corrupt, kleptocratic regime. And in the case of China, I think you're right as well that although I think it's more subtle and sophisticated than it is in Russia. The Russians come with full brunt force. In the case of China, it is to show that their system does deliver. They have brought people out of poverty in the hundreds of millions. And while we in the so-called West are just dithering and people are growing unhappy. But there too, I think they are trying to sow doubt about our system more than they are trying to sell their system. So they, as you rightly said, I think they tap into our lack of confidence. They tap into unhappiness and dissatisfaction that a lot of citizens in this so-called West experience. And we are simply left to be reactive rather than proactive in dealing with this.
I also don't think those are mutually exclusive, right? I mean, these trends are all happening at the same time, and there's no question that whatever you may think about the Chinese form of government, whether you call it a silent democracy, you call it a surveillance state authoritarian country, it is a country very much on the rise in various ways. And I think it's an easy solution to look elsewhere. If you're living in a country like Germany and you see some things you're unhappy about, you're living in France and you're unhappy about other things like the incredibly high youth unemployment rate, for example, they still have in some of these places, it's much easier to look outside and to say, well, maybe we just need a strong leader like Putin, or look at China, they have they're on the rise. What are they doing right? But it's a very simplistic take, but I think this is how a lot of citizens think about it. It's not very nuanced because I think most people live and vote based on their immediate economic situation, the immediate situation of their communities. So that's just a side note. I think you're right, Bobo. There is no model being offered there, but there's an illusion of a model, right? Let me take another round of questions, sir.
I try to be a little bit provocative here. What if This is a war that you can fight.
Sorry, could you introduce yourself, please?
Michał Przybylski. I'm from NGOs. What if this is a fight that you can fight, but you cannot win, and this is just say, natural consequence of a new generation? I mean, like, if you look at the veterans of World War II, they created some society that in the 70s, the hippies, and they just abolished that society. They created a new one. Then in Poland, for example, we were waiting for democracy, which happened in '89, right? And we were hoping to live like Germans. But before we got to Germans level, Germans already had problems with environment, internet came, changed everything, right? So every 30 years, a new generation comes, they're bored with the past, they don't like the past. I even spoke to some guys like 20 years old, and they say like, we are bored, we want something new. Like new generation, they want something new. Maybe we have to experience the landslide of democracy. Maybe they have to experience themselves the lack of freedom. And in 30 years, say, their children will come up and say, like, we want democracy again. Because they don't remember. They don't know what was 30 years ago. Like for me, when I was a teenager, 30 years ago was the Second World War, right? And now for my kids, 30 years ago is our democracy. Something so odd, so old, so far away, they don't care anymore.
Okay, thank you. Yes, please.
Grzegorz Lindenberg, European Issues Institute, Warsaw. I think I'll be even more provocative. We probably all agree with Mr. Kramer that free press, freedom of expression is the basis of all democratic order. So I wonder what you guys think about political correctness and its progeny, hate speech legislation.
Thank you. So we have to move to final comments at this point already, unfortunately. Let me just go in reverse seated order. So David, would you like to start us off?
I tend not to favor control over freedom of expression, though I understand it in some countries given the history. So I think to be absolute about it is probably divorced from the real world. There in the United States, you can't yell fire in a theater, but you can say some horrible things. I would hope, though, that while you probably shouldn't go to jail for that you would be ostracized and that people would condemn you. And I think one of the crises in my country right now is there are things being said by the person at the highest level of the US government, and people are accepting it as normal. There is a normalization of things that in the past would have engendered outrage. And I'm worried, frankly, about the lack of outrage than I am about laws and legislation that would ban it.
So my key point would be possibly that rule of law backsliding, as I have described it, represents a clear and present danger to the existence, and not only to the functioning of the EU, but to the very existence of the EU itself. I think now there is a clear diagnosis that this is an existential issue for the EU. We haven't found a solution yet, but it is very worrying because we have at least two countries which do not comply with EU membership requirements at this stage. If the disease does spread at some point, I cannot exclude that essentially the EU will have to reconstitute itself with all or plenty knock-on damaging impact, not only on the country themselves, but the very population themselves. Sorry.
You have the final word.
Well, just, I guess political correctness is a great way to end, in the sense that I think we need to end the era of political correctness. I think it has cost us too much in terms of showing us both the highs, the potential highs of what it can deliver. And we have seen some really positive and amazing things on the political landscape globally, and especially in the United States with the elevation of President Obama to the highest office in that country as an example of many great things. And then we've also seen the plunging to great depths by the same electorate in the same country, in the same system, with the same electoral colleges and the same political parties and institutions.
Less than a decade.
And yeah, exactly. And so I think that rather than, I do think we need to revisit the institutions and the mechanisms that produce this. But B, we also need to have a realer conversation. We can't be offended by labels and by difficult conversations. I come from Pakistan. As many of you might know, we're going through a very difficult period with our neighbor. And amazingly, at a time when that country has done something, India has done something that for many of us is unimaginable and full of contempt, most Indians support what their government has done. Now, my response can either be to feel hatred in my heart and to refuse to want to talk to them and to want war. And frankly, it's a security forum. I think Pakistan's leaders have demonstrably expressed their readiness for the worst case scenario. But as a human being, I think my first instinct over war would be to be able to talk to these people who clearly hate me and my people. And I think it's that openness to listening. So Trump supporters don't necessarily hate me or people that look like me, but they have legitimate concerns about their own lives that haven't been answered, and we have to address those without getting politically correct and without calling them racist or closing the door. So I would say enough political correctness, let's open the door to conversation, let's base our interactions on fundamental human compassion and love, which we're all capable of feeling for each other, no matter where we're from, no matter what God or lack of God that we worship.
Well, that was a very optimistic note to end on. Even though you started off with pessimism, I appreciate that you flipped at the end of this panel. So I think that's impact right there. So thank you so much. Please join me in thanking this, I think, really interesting panel discussion. Thank you.